In closing government, we have Kyushu B. And in closing opposition, we have IT Bandung A. The final will be judged by Archie Hall, Jasmine Abdullah, Kevin Lee, Mubarak Wasi, Owen Mooney, Sarah Tay, and myself. The motion before the House is this House would abolish the private ownership of property in major metropolitan areas. I would ask the people that are sitting close to the adjudication panel and the stage as a whole, please refrain from speaking between speeches, and also please refrain from clapping during speeches. Please contain your enthusiasm from between speeches and when we call speakers up on stage. Ajko, can we get someone to time from us, please, to take time? Okay. Thank you, Julio. Okay, so without further ado, we call upon the Prime Minister to open the case for side proposition. Hear, hear.
Wait, do you hear me okay now? Okay. So, on to practicalities of the model, right? I think this looks like expropriating the houses and the real estate with reparations on base of the commercial value. Who is going to administrate this real estate when it's not privately owned? I think it's likely that it's going to be the local government, whereas, for example, if we're talking about expropriating Lagos, therefore the local government of Lagos and not the government of Nigeria are the ones who are going to administer this. Why is this important? Because I think local governments are more powerful and know the necessities better than any other government or huge government in comparative. Look at Bogota in comparative with Colombia, right? You in Bogota don't have the same challenges of corruption or the same challenges of not being able to fulfill the needs of the people, or look like the difference between the government of New Delhi whereas the government of India, right? I think local governments have the incentives to work better for their people because they are their primary voters, but secondly, they have more information to know what the people need, right? So how does this look like in reality? I think it looks like expropriating the whole metropolitan area of Lagos, of Bangkok, or Bogota in Colombia. Why is this important? Recognize that for opposition to win this debate, they don't have to defend just private property of real estate on their own, but real property in large metropolitan areas. Large metropolitan areas that have two key challenges nowadays. Firstly, urban planning. Secondly, pricing on real estate. But before closing,
how exactly will people or companies now have the ability to be part of the metropolitan area?
I think it's highly likely that the government is going to decide who gets to live in each part of the area. I'm going to explain why that is better in my point about urban planning, right? Because I was talking to you about the two main challenges of metropolitan areas. One, urban planning. Recognize that lack of urban planning leads to two key points that affect the quality of life of people. Firstly, bad public services such as access to water, such as access to light, such as access to gas, that intrinsically makes people not able to fulfill their needs and to be able to develop themselves. And secondly, it leads to gentrification, right? It leads to people not being able to live in the place they lived before because prices are getting higher and higher. It gets to people not being able to educate their children in the neighborhood they have lived their whole life because now the school is not there, because now we have a big, mall where the school was before. Secondly, the second challenge we have is pricing on real estate. Cities such as Barcelona Paris or Bogota have prices of real estate per meter that exceedingly exceed what people in the area can pay. Recognize that an average citizen of Bogota has not enough money to pay the meter and the amount that the meter costs in reality. Who can pay it? People from outside, people who are not even Colombian, which means that they are impoverished and they cannot afford the place they should be able to live in. So why do we have better urban planning in our side of the house? The problem right now is that people have this idea that private property is the most important thing and no one should take away their privileges that they have with it, right? But what happens is that urban planning requires sacrifices, but secondly, requires community and information that it's global and that it's communal. Recognize that to develop infrastructure, you just don't need one person to be in agreement with you, whereas you need a lot of people working together. What happens in reality is that when people own their houses, your ability to plan and your ability to help them do those sacrifices they need in order to have developed homes or in order to have good public services are harder because you need to make them understand that they need it and make people be in the same area. What happens when the government is able to administer these areas are two main things. Firstly, there are more guarantees of quality of life. I think it's highly likely that what governments are going to do is to uncentralize metropolitan areas and give people the ability to live near the place they work, give people the ability to live where their children are studying, and give people the ability to live where they need to live. In reality, what happens right now in metropolitan areas is that people are not able to do that, basically because the pricings are way too high, but onto that in my second point of analysis. The second point is better public services, right? Because what happens right nowadays is that metropolitan areas grow rapidly, right? Many people arrive to those metropolitan areas and they don't have ways of acquiring the knowledge and the means to work with that people and to award them public services. In a world in which I am able to know where the people are going to live and where they are going, I have more chances of telling them that I am going to award them public services, but even if I don't do it, I have an obligation to do so, and therefore they have more rights and more entitlement to ask me for it. So, on to pricing on real estate. Why do prices fluctuate in reality? Three main reasons. Firstly, real estate is an inelastic good. Secondly, there is high demand for people and many people wanting to buy real estate. And thirdly, it is owned by rich people who see this as a way of gaining wealth. What does this mean in reality? That people from middle class and lower class are forced into mortgages that they cannot pay off in their lives. They are forced into debt and they are forced into constantly having to pay a rent that they are not able to do so. In a world in which the government is the one who's administering this, there are no incentives to go up with the prices because I care for my population, therefore less chances of having high prices on real estate. Proud to propose.
We thank the speaker, and in order to open the case for side opposition, the House calls upon the leader of the opposition. Here.
Oh, sorry. In opening opposition, we believe that there is a worse world for the people and the population that live in lower classes when the state takes away the possibility of, for example, accessing real property, but also how this generates worse incentives within the state that ends up perpetuating inequality within metropolitan areas. That is one we're going to propose. First, principle. Second, state incentives. Third, overpopulation and how this damages cities and state in global warming. First, principle. We believe that taking patrimony of the middle classes that have continuously saved generation after generation to take the possibility of, for example, accessing to a real state-owned property, like a real property, private property, so that in the end they for example, can pass it through generations, and actually, for example, savings within the bank will take away like the price, like money loses value in years, but real property in the end won't. So these kind of savings that the middle classes have access through generations to, for example, generate patrimony to the next to their sons, to their children, to their families, and so not allowing the possibility of these people accessing this. We believe that this, first, is inherently unfair because we are taking away what people have worked for years and years to access this. Even if, for example, certain populations within these situations and classes that have been marginalized, like these populations have had the incentive to work for that, and the state and capitalism has allowed them, for example, to access this. If it's unfair to take their work away, the lifelong possibilities, we believe that that is something that we should not do. So first, in principle, we believe we're winning this debate. But also, we believe that there are state incentives. Panel, think of what happens, for example, with light, with water, such as opening government debt. These places where, for example, higher prices for water and for light, etc., are places where it is a better service. Like, for example, certain parts in metropolitan areas have better services and the water never goes out, the light never goes out, like it has better possibilities of accessing even. If we have this, we generate the same incentives towards the state in the long run. The fact that, for example, certain areas that are more beautiful to access, for example, where certain areas nowadays, like, for example, places where Google or like Facebook have their headquarters, that is more likely that they have more possibilities of accessing this. But even if, for example, they give the same to all communities, it's more likely that in the long run, for example, rich people that are paying more, because obviously the state will select the people or like do taxes in a progressive manner, in which, for example, they will pay like make people that are richer within the state like pay more for rents, for example. These kind of situations allow people that are richer to have more agency to claim the state, for example, for better services, better attendance, and these kind of situations. We believe that these things end up perpetuating inequality, because if I am a poor individual in a metropolitan area, in a community that is not taken care of by the state, because I don't have agency, because I do not have to pay as much taxes as the richer people as it happens nowadays within the states, I'm less likely to be able to access better services, but the state is already giving me something, so they have no incentives in the long run to actually give me these better services. So this continues to perpetuate inequality in their side of the house. Like, this is what happens when people can access, for example, better state property. Second point of analysis in gentrification. Now the state has all the things to say about gentrification. We believe that, for example, the value or the extra value that houses may have when you put a mall beside it is things that are gonna go away. But if, for example, nowadays I have the possibility of, for example, claiming to the state not to put a mall near a beautiful area because I have private property and that is what the state has guaranteed me, it's rather unlikely that the state is going to listen to me because now he owns everything. We believe that in those scenarios, for example, in certain cultural areas such as Chinatown, or certain situations in which people have created communities that are important to them, like, for example, the Israel community within Mexico, we believe in those scenarios, it's rather unlikely that the state is going to listen to these cultural communities and may break their possibility to access to a cultural value in their side. Now, let's go to the last point of analysis, but yes, Juana.
This point of public services at best is the wash, because in their side of the house, rich people are able to still pay a lot for water, for light. So explain to me, why isn't it better on our side of the house?
Because even if, for example, I have the access to private property in certain areas, as it is my place, I can claim the state this. If in your side of the house, a poor individual in a metropolitan area pays less comparatively to a rich individual, it's rather unlikely that the state is going to not listen to him, because he's not taking as much money from that poor individual as he's taking from the rich one. So this is what happens every time, but now we perpetuate inequality. Even if you say it's a wash, in your side of the house, even these people can access, for example, a claim to the state for redistribution. Now they cannot, because they are already given something by the state, which is property and a way to live. And also, for example, now you're condemning them to pay constantly and inherently rents for the rest of their lives. That is money that you're taking them out of their pockets. In the long run, we believe that this is better. Now, last point of analysis, overpopulation. We believe that what happens is, for example, that now as the state has, or the narrative that is sold to the people that are in rural areas, is that the state has, the property in metropolitan areas is state owned, it's more likely that people want to access this because it's more cheap, like it's cheaper to them. So in this scenario, it's more likely that the transfer from rural communities to the center of the state happens more and more. The incentives of the state can go two ways. First, it can create a bigger metropolitan footprint within populations, and this generates the incentives to have more cars, generates the incentives to have more transportation, that in the long run continues to perpetuate climate change. Even if this doesn't happen, we believe that the worst impact of this is that as the state is allowing people to come more to the communities in metropolitan areas, it's rather less likely that the state has incentives to protect the marginalized communities in the long run, because now they have opportunities within the urban spot. And now they have less incentives to take care of those individuals that have been continuously marginalized and perpetuated in poverty. Really glad to oppose.
We thank the leader of the opposition. In order to continue the case for the government side, the House calls upon the Deputy Prime Minister. Here.
Panel, 4 things in the speech. First, why we win on the individual class. Then, why the process of allocation of resources in every metropolitan city will be better. Second, why we have better impacts in terms of urban planning, pricing, and smart transportation. And fourth, why we have a better logic between mid-sized cities, rural areas, and metropolitan areas. So first, on individuals, basically the claim of opposition is that this is unjust because your family has worked a lot to actually get you to your house. First, no reason as to why the house they have right now is actually good. I think that the status quo in most metropolitan cities is not the big house an American family has, for example, in Utah, but actually a very small house that doesn't provide the basic minimum conditions, or at least it's a disproportionate dream, right? Because all of your generations of your family have worked really hard, and the result they are getting is not proportionate to that effort. So I think right now they have to defend a disproportionate effort to a very small result, basic result, that doesn't actually satisfy your effort in the first place. Second, they didn't challenge the reparation part of our model. So I think that the impact they have of having a lot of effort not being rewarded is actually damaged and mitigated by the fact that you're receiving a reparation in the short term. Third, I think that in my side of the house, what will happen is a displacement. That is to say that if, for example, your family wants to work really hard and produce a lot of money in order to invest it in something, the thing is that in their side of the house, they are going to invest it in a very small house that actually costs a lot. Instead, in my side of the house, what we will have is not having the possibility to basically throw your money away into a small house that actually doesn't provide the satisfaction that you need. You will actually, you're more likely to displace that investment into some other stuff that can actually fulfill your life in a better way, such as, for example, education, such as, for example, getting to know the country that you didn't know before, such as, for example, getting gifts to your family and to the people that are close to you if you want to. They also said that this, for example, puts an unjust burden on people because they will always have to pay rent and else. This is uncomparative to the fact that basically basically most people, because of the high prices that they didn't challenge again in the characterizations, mean that you're most likely in their side of the house to also have this burden of always paying rent. The difference is that the rent is controlled by interests that are private in their side of the house, corporate interests, for example, or the fact that someone has, for example, 10 apartments and they want to lease all of their apartments, they want to rent them, and that is the interest that you need to, for example, compare. A private interest instead of a government, then yes, it could be, for example, controlled by electoral cycles, that yes, for example, have direct canals of communication with its people, that yes, can be put, for example, you can put in office someone that actually cares about marginal communities and has more direct influence in the price of their homes, instead of, for example, a private corporation that always sells their home at the highest price in order to make profit. But before, I will take closing if they have something. No? Opening.
How do subsidies work and how do you maintain private property?
Sorry, I didn't understand.
How do subsidies work and how do you maintain private property?
Okay, we are not defending subsidies. What we are defending is control private property that is controlled by the state. That is to say that you are highly likely to have public discussions about the pricing of the rent that you are going to pay between every area. You are likely to have discussions about what areas are going to be allocated. You are going to have discussions about what parts of the land are going to be destined to have for example, urban living areas and which what don't. And this actually gets me to my second point of argumentation, that is on the process of allocation. What we have is that now the fact that where you live and where can people live in a metropolitan area becomes a matter of public discussion in my side of the house, because it will be only controlled by the government. That is to say that public discussion, and every candidate that runs for office in my side of the house has to propose a comprehensive plan about where do we want people to actually live, how much do we want them to pay, and for example, where are we going to have people living. Before that, some external rebuttal to the point of the cultural loss. Panel, in my side of the house, it is highly unlikely that, for example, the New York administration is going to erase Chinatown for several reasons. First, there is traditional value in these communities. That is to say that even, for example, the New York mayor is attached to Chinatown because it adds value to the city. If I erase Chinatown, less tourists are going to go to Chinatown, so no incentives to actually kick the population out of these places. Second, for example, if we find that we are erasing every cultural community in my city, probably the next office will, for example, be held by someone that actually cares about these people, or these people will vote for someone that is not going to structurally erase them from the map. So I think it's highly unlikely that we will have that cultural loss they characterize in their side of the house. Now on the process of allocation, I will continue. What we have is that basically this becomes a matter of public discussions. This means that we will, for example, abide and obey the public interest of the people. If they didn't challenge the fact that cities are more progressive and that governments in cities tend to be, for example, more technical and tend to be to actually care more about the population because of the proximity they have, then they need to accept that that public discussion is likely to be good and actually healthy in my side of the house. Note that, for example, the most progressive people in politics are not, for example, presidents, but majors. That's why, for example, the first lesbian president in America was the mayor of Chicago, was not the president of the United States. Same case for Bogota. That is to say that, for example, the most prepared people are usually running for local elections instead of, for example, national elections, and they have way more control. So we will have a nice discussion about what we want. Now I'm going to add up something on mid-sized local and rural areas, where when big metropolitan areas cannot, for example, have private property, but you still have some big interest corporations that want to have private property, or for example, you have a lot of exchange of capital and you want to invest this somewhere, you won't be able to do this in metropolitan areas that have already, for example, a lot of public services and have, for example, a disproportionate amount of resources in the status quo. If you want to have private property, and we accept that there will be people that want to have private property, they will be actually compelled to do it elsewhere. Where? Specifically, midtown size metropolitan areas where, for example, invested is needed in order to have some cash flow. If we, for example, have a lot of corporations investing in mid-sized cities and rural areas, we can not only have some cash flow and development because of the investment they are making, we can also, for example, tax them as the national government to have some more money than reinvested in the public. So I think that basically what we're doing is displacing a disproportionate amount of resources that is being allocated to big metropolitan areas to basically mid-sized areas and rural areas. The other thing that Juanita told you in her speech is that we will have better urban planning, pricing, and mass transportation. Panel, in my side of the house, governments do not have an interest in placing people afar, because if they place them afar and they have to provide public transportation, that means higher cost for them. They have the contrary incentive. They have the incentives to place people closer to the place they study, closer to the place they work, in order to have them, for example, walking or taking a bike, instead of, for example, having them saying in the elections, because you put me very far from where I work, now I need some public transportation, or even better public transportation. They have incentives to be efficient. They have incentives to strategically locate people where where they will, for example, spend less money in an efficient way. They also said we were likely to exclude communities. I think that the exclusion of community happens when we only obey private interests. In my side of the house, these people have more agency because now they can enter a public discussion with electoral incentives to actually have a say when it comes to, for example, where we live in and how the city is planned. For all these reasons, we are extremely proud to propose.
We thank the Deputy Prime Minister. In order to close the top half of the debate, we call upon the Deputy Leader of the Opposition here.
In opening opposition, we do not like private property, but we believe that in a world in which it is the only thing that is valued, private property gives you a chance to go against the state, gives you a chance to have something that protects you, and we believe that we'd rather have that alternative. Opening government talks about 4 things that prevent clashes, and we're going to explain in a comparative why those things are better, how we protect minorities, how in the long run we are better in our side of the house. First, they say locals are better, and notice the last thing that Porto say, because they both complain about gentrification and how it is really bad, but then he says, if you want to invest, you're going to go invest elsewhere. You're going to create more gentrification in other places, so their impact is I'm going to gentrify other places in the country. We do not understand how this is positive. Then they say, I'm going to give you incentives, because if I move you from where you were living and you still need to go to work, I'm going to create public transportation. First, in the status quo, they still need to give them public transportation in order for them to work, because the state needs people to work in order to get taxes, because they need to be productive. But the difference is that you're not going to displace them in our side of the house. You're not going to take away the thing they worked for. You're not going to take away the cultural value they had in their house, the people in which the place in which they were raised. We believe that comparative exists in our side, because the state needs to guarantee them way to go to work, where we are now displacing them. We believe that's better. Then they say local governments is better because they have a lot of incentives. Juanita says like people are voters. We believe that this is super problematic, first of all, because it generates clientelistic measures. Like I am only going to vote for the people that's not going to displace me. I'm going to be completely living under fear, because I may lose my house if I don't vote for a specific party. We believe that that's intrinsically problematic, but furthermore important than that, we believe that the people that already have power in the status quo related to real estate are people that are going to control politics. For example, in Medellin, in Colombia, a lot of conservatives have a lot of money, and they influence a lot the way the policies are made in the status quo. We believe that when I have the power of real estate, and when I am able to influence the way local governments are going to manage the city, we believe that that's problematic, because I have more influence if I have more money, and that comparatively is worse in the status quo. We believe we'd rather have the what we're saying, because that's worse. We do not want people to use clientelism to say, if you don't vote for me, I'm going to take away your house. We'd rather not have that, and we'd rather not having rich conservatives managing our politics. We say that clash point of locals are better is won by the opening opposition. Then they say things about urban planning. They say we're going to have better sense of community. Think about Mr. Fredrickson from the movie Up. The only reason the mall was not built destroying his house because it was his property. He was able to stand against it. The only reason we can sell an airport project in Mexico is because the community owned the land, and we say, no, we do not want you to destroy land. We do not want you to pollute our stuff, because it is ours. We believe that when they say we'd rather have community projects, but what if those community projects affect minorities? What if building your airport that's going to bring you more economic development. It's going to tear down apart a rainforest. It's going to go like against like the local rivers. It's going to pollute. It's going to do a lot of things. We believe that that sense of community affects people that have at least saying in the decisions because they have less capital. We believe that the alternative is saying, no, this land is mine. No, I own this. No, this is mine. We believe that that alternative is better. Community may exist in the last of the house, but damaging those who have not a saying. We'd rather have the alternative to go against the state. We'd rather have the alternative to protect ourselves. Then when they say we decentralize the city, Ruben explains why that is not likely to happen, because in the end, for example, people that pay more taxes when they own a house, people that invest more in societies are more likely to be the state is more likely to invest in those funds. We believe that what ends up happening is that you're going to still centralize everything within the city, and that's intrinsically problematic. But their best case, in which it's cheaper and people go to the cities, then what we're doing is even if you decentralize the city, you centralize the country, and that's worse because when you centralize a country, you have less incentives to invest, for example, in the outer part of the state. We believe that's intrinsically problematic. We'd rather not have that. So the both alternatives they propose, it's first of all, less incentives of the state of investing elsewhere, and people that want to invest are going to gentrify it because like they're going to buy lands elsewhere. We believe that that's problematic. And when it comes to urban planning gets better when we have a way to oppose the state, when we are not creating a false sense of community. Then they say public services, and I used a point of information to ask Porto how the subsidies work. Like, houses need still maintenance. We still need to pay stuff. Like, we still need to rebuild them, to paint them, whatever, in order for them to be actually suitable for living. Where that money is going to come from? First of all, if the state pays all of it, like, money is not something that we all have. Resources are finite. That means that eventually they will need to cut resources from other social programs which end up affecting other part of the populations that live within the city, which is problematic because if now I have to pay for your house, I cannot pay for your health. If I have to pay for your house, I cannot pay for your education. We believe that that's intrinsically problematic, and that exists on the side of the house. The alternative, if the state is not paying for everything, is that the people have to stay. What's the difference? That you condemn them forever to have to pay rent because you need to do that the entire time. In our side of the house, you can pay while you are able to work. You can retire and you have your own house. In their side of the house, they don't have because they still need to pay. We believe, yes, people are marginalized in your side of the house. Yes, people are homeless, but we'd rather have some homeless people, but the government with incentives and money to invest in them than the alternative, which is the government, even if they have the incentives, having less resources. We believe that that comparative is worse on the side of the house. Last chance.
You're not defending natural populations on reserves that have land. You're defending people in the cities that have to pay rent, in your case, for their entire life. And by the way, you can get money from
thank you. That's the last clash point. Like, real estate prices are not going down. Like, owners of real estate are shit. We agree with that premise, but let's take a comparative. When the state is the one that is actually is the one that puts the price, there's no one you can go to if you can afford it. There's no one you can go to if they kick you out of your house. In our side of the house, if 20th century kicks me out, I have to go to the government and say they're doing bad things to me, do something. But when the state is the one that do so, there's no way you can go to. There's no check and balance. There's no way they can supervise, and that's worse in their scenario because I have no alternative. Who am I going to go if the state is the one that oppresses me? I have nowhere to go. We believe that that's more problematic in their side of the house. We'd rather not have that comparative because local governments are not as cool as they say, because we don't want marginalized people to be gentrified, because we want better urban planning, because we want public services to be better. I'm pretty happy to oppose.
We thank Deputy Leader of the Opposition. In order to start the back half of the debate, we call upon the Member of Government. Here.
That's. Okay. Sorry. If you are a rural people and you are poor, you want to go to Tokyo and renting a house, you'll probably be shocked by the price that you have to pay in order to rent that house. And the reason behind is because of the private ownership of the house in Tokyo is super high that block you out of the accessibility. And we think that exactly the problem in the current situations. What we're going to bring you today in extension from closing government is two main things. The first question is when the state have the right to abolish a certain private property right. And secondly, why we can bring more accessibility for the poor and for the rural people, and why we think that is impactful enough for us to take the debate. But before that, a couple of rebuttal for opening oppositions. Opening opposition main case premise on the fact that like if you have private property, you have the check and balance power, and like therefore you can check the state whether or not they are corrupted or like they have problematic in the policy. We don't buy that premise because we think that like there is another thing called voting. We have the other thing called elections. That like 4 years, at the time that you have to vote for a new governance that can actually determine whether or not they do a good job or bad in order to like select them for the next 4 years. So we think that like that is enough incentive for the state in order to like make sure that they remain powerful, and also that is enough incentive for the people to use their vote in the proper way, because now they know what like they cannot use their property right in order to fight against the state. Therefore they will more focus on voting because they know what like voting is the only way for them now to against the state, which means that like, more voter turnouts, more people engage with the politics, and more people to willing like to access and like to discuss about like how the state is good or bad in the current situation. We think that is much more better in outside of how in terms of discourse and in terms of like how people check and balance the policy of the governments. No, thank you. With that have been said, let's talk about our extension. Sorry, I had time. Okay. So the first extension is the questions of like when the state have the justifications to abolish a certain property rights. And we think that is two main criteria. Number one, that is when that is fundamentals and is required for all people to get access to that. And number two, that is when in the current situation, all people is not equally be distributed and cannot get accessibility to those kind of things. No, thank you. And we think in the first question, we are in the consensus of a debate that is to say housing and housing property is fundamentally, because that is the way you live is going to determine who you are. It determines the community that you live in. It determines your belief. It also determines your identity. It also determines a lot of opportunities that you're going to get, and like therefore get access and get to the equally distribution of housing is fundamentally important for the state. That's a similar analogies to like medical care or like to the other things in the current situation. No, thank you. But then here come to the more significant clash. That is to say, it is fair, it is accessibility for all people in the current situation. And we think that is, the answer is no. Why? That's so couple of points. Number one, then that's directly clash with the opening opposition, because they say that like, you know, we owe the land because like, we work hard for that kind of thing and we don't buy that kind of thing. You owe the land in metropolitan city. It's just a mere bird lottery. So let me explain for you why. You happened to own a land 100 years ago in Tokyo when there was a small city that no one really knows about that, and 100 years later it's become a big city that the price rising, and like therefore you automatically owe a lot of money thanks to that. So it doesn't really your effort to actually make those kind of things better. It is happen to like it's just that the state happen to choose your living place into like a big city and make it bigger to attract more investors to your city, and like therefore you can like magically gain more money than like the other people. And we think that is unfair. Now that's something that problematic that we need to solve. No, thank you. But why does actually block accessibility? Because when you own that car plan, in most of the case in metropolitan city, when you own that car plan, you not stop at that. You're going to stop your money by buying more land, and like you use that as a way to block other people to buy those car land. So we see a lot of people, they're super rich people, they real estate, they hold a lot of land, but they don't want to use that. They don't want to share that for other people. What does this mean? This means that like they just like kick out other people chance to get access to that kind of thing just because they happen not to born in that kind of place in the first place. Now they cannot access to that kind of thing. But why those kind of accessibility is so important? We think that accessibility to metropolitan city is extremely important because that is actually a lot of chance for people to develop themselves. Big university, like big company and like big investor and banking, all of those kind of things are centralized in metropolitans. But now you cannot access to that because you cannot rent a house to stay in the city in the first place. And the reason behind is because like, a lot of people and like, a lot of selfish rich people buying land and stock that as a form of money that actually block you out and actually make people and make the poor people suffering in the constitution. Why it is harmful? We think it pack in two house. Number one is make the geographic barrier become more severe. That is to say, rural people cannot access to a lot of things that can actually develop themselves. But secondly, it also hard for state to reallocate resources and to break down metropolitan city in the constitution. The fact that like, people don't want to devalue the price of their land means that like, they have more incentive in order like, to make the city in the form of SE. They don't want to expand the city more or like make other city surrounding them become like a small city, like to allocate people to all the other part because that's reduce the friend. So that bad incentive just make like the accessibility problem become more severe just because of the private property. Before moving on, I take opening. Okay, the problem is not like housing is not enough. The problem is that like some people like take housing more than they need in the constitution. That to say, rich people they need only one house for a family, but like they owe more than that, and like they use that as a form to stock their money, and we think that is unjust, and that is a deny other people right in the constitution. Why is outside how we can get the thing better? I think that like opening opposition did slightly, opening government did a slightly good job in terms of like speaking of like how public service is going to do, but we think that like we go more communist way. That to say, we allocate the land equally for all people. A lot of people now stock a lot of land and don't use that, so we take that land from these people and allocate that into like a square equally for all. And like if you come to that then you are welcome, and you can get access to all of the things that like the rural people now can go to that. But secondly, we think that like they also better because and now the state also have the incentive to expand the land because the counter mechanism of like the rich people want like to use like their bad influence in order to like to block the expand and to block like the other people to accept. Now it's being removed when they cannot own their private, like when they cannot own their stock as a form of housing anymore. And we think that is good because now people can fairly access to something that's fundamental for them and get access to the chance equally and improve their life. Very, very proud to propose.
We thank the member of government in order to start the case for the closing opposition. The House calls upon the member of the opposition. Hear, hear.
Sorry guys, my teammate wants to go to the toilet first, so I think he wants to hear my speech. Is it okay if we wait, or I don't know, wait. I think I'll just start. Wait. I think I'll just start. It's okay. I think he can hear it from the top. That's okay. As an architecture and urban planning student, currently working closely together with a lot of slum areas, communities in Indonesia, I think that it's fair to say that giving away the central business district only towards the richest of the landowners seems evil. But trust me, it is something that's absolutely necessary for the survival for the city and even counterintuitively for the fulfillment of the rights of marginalized communities within cities. That's what we're going to stand today on Closing Opposition. Closing Opposition will be the only team that really talks about how cities work and how government of cities make decisions and how land market actually influences these particular decisions. Before I move on to my case, one quick comment towards the case of closing government. they basically opened the case by saying that everyone wants to live in the middle of the city of Tokyo. In their world, how will governments decide who gets to live in the middle of the city? Notice that cities within like a metropolitan city have very limited capacity in terms of housing. It means that what happens is not only that government will choose poorly, but often will choose in the most oppressive statistics. Looking at things like, for instance, the Kuala Lumpur city government only creating exclusively Bumiputra housing in the middle of the city and things like that. I will get onto that later more on my argument, but this will get to the point. They don't get any counter mechanism and any explanation whatever on both benches on how government really makes decisions in terms of creating good economic value and good livelihood towards these particular individuals within cities. So let's talk about how cities work. If you look at cities and metropolitan cities, you would always realize that it gets higher up into those ladder. In the middle. What it means that the highest buildings usually located in the middle because it is the highest amount of economic value. And the meaning of that, it is the highest economic activities and also the most expensive buildings happens within that middle of the city. That happens because of market mechanism or exclusively because of private property. And this is something that's actually very beneficial for several reasons. At the point you have a very high land value in terms of in the middle of the city, and land prices are inelastic, right? So it means that governments have to buy them out anyway, and that's out of the house. It means that it's good because now it is being bought by really large multinational corporations and things like that, and it gives city governments really good benefits in terms of having so high revenues in terms of creating countless amounts of jobs, even for the poorer communities, because they need people like working as janitors and employees of McDonald's and things like that within this particular buildings. But it have exceedingly amount of good value for the city government because it gives tax revenues in terms of the economic activity within those particular buildings, which is really tall. You have like a lot of malls, and you have a lot of offices and luxury apartments and things like that. But also taxes from the land ownership itself, ladies and gentlemen. And this is really large money, which is used really good by the government. Why? Because most of their arguments is contingent upon the quality of life of poor people, slum area dwellers, and so on. We think that they can't run an argument simply saying if slum dwellers do not live in the middle of the city, then their lives would be miserable. Because if you look at the best cities within the world, what they have is redistribution of their funds coming from the central business districts towards things like good public transportation and good development of satellite cities. And this is something that's very important, ladies and gentlemen. Knowing that we have limited capacity within the city center to begin with, we need to make sure that satellite cities and so good public transportation are made to begin with, to make sure that some individuals can then live there in good developed public housing, because the governments of the particular cities have enough money coming from these central business districts to actually develop these particular policies. They say that there are constituents of attachments in terms of you already lived there for a lot of times. But notice this, the way that governments can create communities and good livelihood of living is not contingent upon whether the neighborhood is within the middle of the city or not. These monies are used for a lot of things, for getting great design in terms of this public housing to create a good sense of community. And of course, things like participatory design and participatory planning with the communities themselves, and asking them what do you want in particular to make the feel of the kampungs or the feel of the slum areas still being felt at the communities and togetherness still being felt in the new public housing development. It also looks things like development of local hubs and local centers in these particular satellite cities, also things like traditional markets, things like hospitals and schools and cultural spaces for these particular communities. So it's unclear on that side of the house why in particular then that the poorest within communities cannot be living well, because the comparative would be slum areas on that side of the house that might still be protected, but governments are less able to make good policies and good development from them, because now the governments do not have the particular good satellite cities and a lot of money coming from on that side of the house. No, thank you. But what's the comparative done on that side of the house? We think that, first of all, how do then central business districts are developed within their side of the house? This is something of very important extension. It means that, first of all, the selection of which businesses go to which buildings will be skewed but not by market, but by connections that the government have to begin with. So the selection of which businesses placed in the tallest buildings, for instance, will be within connections that are not economical and market in nature, but things like elitism and close relations towards the politicians themselves. And we think that this is bad because it means that there will be inefficiencies in terms of the operations of these central business districts. The consequence of these inefficiencies is that the government have significantly less income coming coming from the activities within the central business districts because of poor decision making in terms of deciding the business climate or the economic climate within the central business district. But furthermore, ladies and gentlemen, we think that we have a very huge benefit, not here and outside of the house, by relying on market mechanism. Why? Because when you rely on market mechanism, it means that the highest bidder will want to build the best and highest buildings in terms of the middle of the city. The problem is when the government are the ones that buying out their land and renting out to businesses, it means it's harder for us to lure businesses to actually want to be the one that bear the brunt of all these constructions and of the operations of these buildings, because now they have the bargaining position as companies to say that I have to pay rent. Then the government are the ones that are responsible to make sure that they are the ones that build these particular facilities and are the ones that operate these facilities and simply have to pay rent. Notice that the initial cost of building and developing and operating buildings are much higher compared to any affordable amount of rent in the set of the house, because the businesses already have like bargaining power to begin with in these particular cases. Also, ladies and gentlemen, we think that means that in their landscape, they also want to prioritize things like housing and parks and monuments within the middle of the cities, which is all good, but then you have to select which race or which particular group will have that. Like, it will be very tight upon the politics and in terms of political climate and also who's the majority in these particular places. And the good thing about having satellite cities being part of the development, which is more housing, which is more community, is that everyone can be in basically have different groups or even mixed groups, but all with basically same privilege, because no one of them are actually living in the middle of the city. The moment you make governments are able to and not the market to be able to rule the middle of the city, then unfair things can happen. And all the money that is usually can be used for public transportation for this development of satellite cities will now be able to have to be forced towards the development of these city centers to begin with, and therefore sacrificing these particular satellite cities and sacrificing even more poor people on their side of the house. We're extremely proud to oppose.
We thank the member of the opposition. In order to conclude the government bench, the House calls upon the government whip. Hear, hear.
Start? Hello? Okay. Three pieces of extension from my partner that haven't been contested. First, my partner explained to you why comparatively it's better to resort to politics in distribution of land and real estate property as compared to the status quo where rich people disproportionately hold on to unnecessary amount of property. Secondly, my partner have told you, in addition to the opening government's vague mechanism of how poor people have more access, explaining how the problem in the status quo is that rich people, because they have incentive to keep their real estate property valuable, that limit the expand of cities and limit the development of other cities, and how rich people, because precisely real estate is now a tradable property, it gives incentive for rich people to get a lot of like real estate property that systematically deny the access of poor people in mega cities, in those large cities, which we think is a requirement for them to climb up the social ladder. That is the third extension when we talk about why it is important to give poor people the access to cities. Opening.
How are local governments that generally do not have their communist principle are not going to preserve incentives, to have perverse incentives like clientelistic ones to perpetuate through having the power of the house you own and the money of those taxes?
Okay, that has been our first point of extension. Recognize the whole the whole off bench failed to explain in comparative, right? They said something of how people are going to have connections with politicians and influence politics. But note, in the status quo, rich people are holding on those property that people outside this mega city do not have access to at all. But at least on our side, taking, no matter it's like the government of the whole state or the government of the city, consider of the constituency of that government, there's more people who are poor, more people that do not have access to real estate, right? We think comparatively, politics is a better way to solve that. Their side is presuming, oh, government is really corrupted, government are evil actors. If government is so evil, how can you solve the problem of real estate at all, right? How can you even have any alternative to solve the problem? Now, let's deal with the whole government bench, which some of those already addressed. So first, on the opening government opening opposition, I've been wrong all the time. Opening opposition talk about how some people have identity attached to things like Chinatown and stuff, right? We do recognize that identity is important, but the thing is, now, first of all, you're denying the other people's access to the identity that they want to belong to. There are millions of people that want to be a part of New York, right? They want to climb up the social ladder, be able to work at large firms, right? They want to have a life in cities. They want to discard their identity as rural people and want the identity of people from large cities, right? We think first, on your side, you're denying a much larger group of people of access to identity. Second of all, we don't think Chinatown will just disappear on their side, because note, there's a mechanism for the government of making decision of how do you allocate the real estate property. We think there's still groups that can lobby for, oh, let's remain Chinatown, right? There are also constituency that say our identity of remaining Chinatown is important, and so on and so forth, right? Secondly, we think government in general, especially in liberal democratic background, have the incentive to appreciate diversity in culture and diversity in identity. So I think the problem that the opening opposition talk about will not happen. Secondly, opening opposition didn't talk about personal property is important. That is precisely due with my partner's principal argument by saying that, yes, you have personal property now, but first of all, largely for people who is able to get a house in Tokyo and Beijing, it means that at least you're extremely well educated, right? At least you have some property to stay there as first place, right? You have access to the best education in the country, right? Which means those people comparatively already extremely privileged compared to some others, right? Secondly, we think there's a trade-off in rights and trade-off in there's a trade-off in right, because on their side they are protecting the right of personal property. But on our side, we say there's a much more important right for a much larger group of people that is more underprivileged. That is the right for the poor people to climb up the social ladder. My partner also told you why it is so unique about going to large cities like Beijing and Tokyo, because recognize in a world where there's mega city is at the heart of the country, and all of the industry is centralized as those city. It means other means such as open a small businesses as your local area do not allow you to climb up the social ladder to enter the upper classes, right? We think comparatively, their property right is first undermined because it's oftentimes unjustly acquired, and secondly, we're protecting some more important right of that state have responsibility to protect. Closing, do you have anything? I think that is a very innocent argument, because there's a lot of country that is extremely huge. Let's take example for China, and you need to have 5-hour commute to your work. I don't think that is realistic. Then let's then address the closing opposition. Note that closing opposition already missed the chance to systematically engage with our point of how access to mega cities is important, and how it is unjust for us to allow those rich people to still hold on to the property that systematically deny the access of poor people into mega city and access to climbing up the social ladder. It's too late from whip speaker at the first place. Secondly, their argument of how that like the connections with government is also is destroyed by my analysis of how comparatively on your side you do not have an alternative like mechanism to deal with how rich people are holding on to this property, right? We think at least we can give a shot for the politics. Like if politics is good and if we have faith in politics, then problem gets solved. If politics is really bad, government is corrupted, I guess it's no point of debating this motion. Very proud to oppose.
We thank the government whip. In order to conclude the opposition bench, the debate as a whole, and the EFL track of Worlds 2020, we call upon the opposition whip. Here.
There's quite a lack of engagement coming from closing government to our case. I want to talk about three things. I want to talk about the money that will be lost by the local government in government bench that we will not lose on our side. Secondly, I want to talk about the money that is earned by the local government in closing opposition that you will not earn in the entirety of the government bench. And third and finally, I want to talk about the livelihood of ordinary people and how it necessitates capital, and it necessitates an understanding of the market that is not vulnerable to the populism that is government. Let's begin with the money that you lost in local government. Our opening talks about paying for the existing private buildings. We talk in closing opposition about the most cost-intensive part of government bench mechanism. That is all the future infrastructure building that you need to do, that you now need to do on your own rather than being done by company or being done by investors, because now they do not own the private property rights of this land any longer, and they will not own the buildings any longer. My partner characterization on high-rise building and apartment in center of the city are very, very key in this debate. Why? Because these are things that are very expensive. Note that it's not enough for their side to just buy all the existing buildings and all the existing housings inside of this metropolitan area. What do they need to do in their side? Number one, you need to build more and more buildings. Why? Because sooner or later you will need more business, ladies and gentlemen, because there's a booming startups in many metropolitan cities. There are more work opportunity that is needed for the society at the end of the day, because they need to be able to work. That's why you need to build even more office spaces, right? So that the increasing population will be able to work as well. Secondly, note that the thing with metropolitan city is that sooner or later population will increase, because there's a younger population like the millennials that want to own their own places. There will be new children of the millennials who will later on have their own children. The population will increase and boom sooner or later. And as population grow, you will need even more housing. There will be more apartment that you need to build at the end of the day. This is the huge cost that will be incurred by government in their case. When government needs to pay for the cost of reclamation, when government needs to pay the cost of building new apartment buildings, when government needs to pay for the operationalization and the maintenance of all this. This is the money that you need to incur. This is the money that they lost. In government bench, you will never get a return of investment from all this money that you lost. You will never break even. Why? Because take a look at the entirety of their case. Their whole point is that they want this to be as affordable as possible. That's why under their system of rent, ladies and gentlemen, they would like the rent to be as cheap as possible at the end of the day, so that more people will be able to afford. That's why government will never be able to incur the money back due to that very limited rent at the end of the day, while the cost is already very insane. But secondly, when government began buying land to build new infrastructure buildings at the end of the day, to fulfill the need of the rising population, what it means is that land is getting much higher in demand. And because it increases in demand, the prices increase as well. Because all the remaining private property landowner will realize that this is something that's highly in demand, and it becomes convenient for them to jack the price even further at the end of the day. That's why the money that they lose will be very significant. That's the money that they are not going to get a return. Put it with our comparative, which is the money that you eventually earn on our side in closing opposition. I'll take you later after this clash. Look, I want to engage with the biggest fallacy of the government bench, that the government is perfect and trustworthy. Now, opposition web brings an interesting engagement. If government is bad, why do we trust them to begin with? Why do we trust them to make policies for us? Look, I want to make it very clear here. Government do not care about people. They care about being re-elected. Occasionally, their political interest of being re-elected is in line and in accordance with the interests of the society that they claim to serve. In law, for example, if there's a huge amount of crime, people will be harmed, we will not like it, we will not vote for government who fail to stop the crime at the end of the day. But things are totally different with city building and city organizing, ladies and gentlemen, because government will want to do something populist. They also want to do something whose benefits are seen in the short term rather than the long term. This is where my partner's extension comes in, because it means that they will do exactly what closing government want. For example, they will make it so that people can now live in the middle of the city of Tokyo. People will now get something, right? They get that feeling of euphoria that they now can afford living in the middle of the city, while back then they cannot. They will now be able to see, for example, new infrastructure building when government build beautiful monuments or lots of parks so that you have lots of green areas and lots of trees to see around. But what are the costs that you take for that boost of populism? What are the costs that you take so that you can get an edge in that upcoming election? Your cost is the kind of central business district that is very key are now not being built. What we believe on our side is that we think that land should be owned by the highest bidder. Why? Because we think that when you are the highest bidder, you want to make sure that you will be able to utilize it as much as possible. And we think that central business district are key. They are not populous, but in the near future, when the new generation needs more jobs, it will be too late if it's already sacrificed for people being able to live in this area. Yeah, opening.
Yes, the fact that you can still tax economical transaction, and income means you have the money to build things. And the second thing is that the fact that corporations need to sell things that they can only sell in big metropolitan cities means that they are still coming to your cities, they are not living everywhere, they need to sell things.
I'm not saying that there will be no companies inside of your cities. I'm saying that the amount will be significantly less because you have less office spaces due to all the office spaces that you now change into housing so that people can live in the middle of the city. I'm saying that there will be lots of people who will be able to back in our side be investors that are now unable to be those investors because now it's all under the government control. It means that you don't have the highest bidder that want to create the biggest profit to be taxed. What you have is a government that want to be as populous as possible. That's why they open it to as much people as possible, but you lack those tax revenue. Lastly, the livelihood of ordinary people. Because you do note that things like interconnected transportation, things like water drainage basin to prevent floods like in Jakarta, things like redistribution to the less well-off, that needs a huge amount of capital. And that's what you lose in their side when you focus on those populist narrative on allowing as many people to live in the middle of the city. But secondly, their only defense to our point in being in the middle of the city and also living in the outskirts is like the country is big. Well, we think number one, there are lots of outskirts around, but secondly, transportation is inherently beneficial. Everyone needs it. We don't understand why it shouldn't be developed for people in the outskirts. We proudly oppose.
We thank the opposition whip, and may we please get another round of applause for all speakers of the finals.